The sun beat down mercilessly on the parched desert trail, a relentless enemy that had claimed many lives before. Zoe Michaels staggered forward, her vision blurring as the endless expanse of sand and rock swam before her eyes. She'd known the journey would be difficult, but she hadn't expected her guide to abandon her when their wagon broke an axle, taking the last full canteen with him. The year was 1876, and the Arizona Territory was as unforgiving as it was beautiful. Zoe had left her comfortable life in Boston with dreams of teaching in the frontier town of Wallace Creek, not to be confused with the mining town in Idaho, where her uncle had secured her a position at the newly established schoolhouse. She'd written countless letters about her impending adventure, filled with optimistic plans and romantic notions of the West. Now, those dreams seemed foolish as she stumbled over a rock and fell to her knees. Her throat burned with thirst, and the sun's rays felt like hot pokers against her exposed neck and face. The small bonnet that had seemed so fashionable in Boston provided little protection here, and her traveling dress, though modified for the journey, clung to her sweat-soaked body. "Water," she whispered, her voice a raspy shadow of itself. "Please, just a drop." Zoe tried to stand, but her legs refused to cooperate. The world tilted dangerously, and she collapsed onto the hard, dusty ground. As consciousness began to slip away, she thought she heard the distant sound of hoofbeats. A hallucination, she decided, brought on by the heat and dehydration. The rhythmic pounding grew louder, more insistent. With her last ounce of strength, Zoe turned her head and saw a figure on horseback approaching through the heat waves. The rider's form shimmered like a mirage, tall and broad-shouldered against the punishing sky. Miss, can you hear me?" The voice seemed to come from very far away. Rough hands gently turned her over, and Zoe found herself looking up into the most startlingly blue eyes she had ever seen, set in a sun-bronzed face beneath a wide-brimmed hat. "Hold on," the man said, his voice deep and urgent. "I've got water." Zoe felt herself being lifted slightly, her head cradled in the crook of a strong arm. Something cool pressed against her cracked lips, a canteen. The blessed relief of water trickled into her mouth. "Slow now," the man cautioned. "Too much too fast will make you sick." She wanted to drink it all, to drown herself in the life-giving liquid, but the stranger carefully controlled her intake. As her eyes began to focus, she could make out more of his features, the strong jaw darkened by several days' growth of beard, the faint lines at the corners of his eyes that spoke of years squinting against the sun. "There you are," he said softly, as awareness returned to her gaze. "I thought I'd lost you for a moment." "Thank you," Zoe managed to whisper. "Luke Irving," the man said, tipping his hat slightly. "And you are Zoe Michaels," she replied, her voice gaining a fraction more strength. "I was headed to Wallace Creek." Luke frowned, his blue eyes darkening with concern. "Wallace Creek is still 30 miles from here, Miss Michaels. What happened to your wagon, your companions?" Zoe closed her eyes briefly, shame and anger washing over her. "The wagon broke an axle about 5 miles back. My guide," she swallowed hard, "decided I wasn't worth the trouble and took the horses, left me with almost no water." A string of colorful curses escaped Luke's lips before he caught himself. "My apologies, Miss Michaels. That no good," he stopped again. "No one deserves to be abandoned out here." He helped her take another careful sip of water, his calloused hand surprisingly gentle as it supported her head. "I'm going to get you somewhere safe," he promised, his eyes meeting hers with unexpected intensity. "You have my word on that. Why would you help a stranger?" Zoe asked, her voice still weak. Luke's expression softened slightly. "Out here, refusing to help someone in need is a death sentence. I wouldn't wish that on anyone." He paused, looking out at the merciless landscape. "I've seen what the desert does to people. Not while I draw breath would I leave someone to that fate." As Zoe took another sip of water, Luke continued, "I'm making you a promise, Miss Michaels. I'll see you safe to Wallace Creek or die trying." Something in his voice made Zoe believe him completely. "Can you stand?" Luke asked after a few more minutes of careful hydration. "I think so," Zoe replied, though she wasn't entirely sure. With Luke's strong support, she managed to get to her feet, though her legs trembled alarmingly. "My camp is about a mile from here," Luke said, his arm steady around her waist. "My horse can carry us both that far." He helped her onto his chestnut stallion before swinging up behind her. His arms encircled her as he took the reins, and Zoe felt herself lean back against his chest, too exhausted to maintain her usual propriety. "Rest if you can," Luke said, his voice close to her ear. "I won't let you fall." As the horse began to move at a gentle walk, Zoe allowed herself to relax marginally. The steady rhythm of the animal's gait and the solid presence of the man behind her provided a comfort she hadn't expected to find in this harsh wilderness. "Were you just passing through?" she asked, trying to focus on something other than her physical distress. "Heading to Wallace Creek myself," Luke replied. "I've got a small spread about 10 miles outside town, been away on business in Tucson." "You're a rancher," she felt his slight chuckle rumble through his chest. "On my better days." "Cattle mainly, though I've been known to break horses when the need arises." Zoe tried to picture this man, this stranger who had quite literally saved her life working his own ranch, riding the range, building something from nothing in this untamed land. Despite her current state, she found herself curious about him. "Have you been in Arizona long?" she asked. "Since '68, he replied. "Came west after the war with not much more than the clothes on my back and a determination to never take orders again. The war." He would have been quite young, Zoe realized. She was 23 now, born in '53, which would make Luke. "I was 18 when I enlisted," he said, as if reading her thoughts. "Spent 3 years fighting for the Union, saw things no man should see." "I'm sorry," Zoe said quietly. "Don't be," Luke replied, his tone lighter. "It led me here, and I wouldn't trade my life now for anything." They continued in comfortable silence until a small camp came into view. It wasn't much, a simple lean-to for shelter. A fire pit with the remains of a morning fire, and supplies neatly organized under a canvas tarp. Luke dismounted first, then reached up to help Zoe down. Her legs buckled as soon as her feet touched the ground, but Luke caught her easily, scooping her up into his arms. "I can walk," she protested weakly. "No offense, Miss Michaels, but you can barely stand," Luke said, carrying her to the lean-to and gently setting her down on a bedroll. "Rest. I'll get some food in you and we'll see about continuing to Wallace Creek tomorrow." "Tomorrow?" Zoe tried to sit up, alarmed. "But I need to be there. You need to recover," Luke interrupted firmly. "Wallace Creek has waited this long for its schoolteacher. It can wait one more day." Zoe blinked in surprise. "How did you know I'm the new teacher?" Luke smiled slightly as he moved to the fire pit and began building a new fire. "Small communities like Wallace Creek don't keep many secrets, Miss Michaels. Word's been going around for weeks that the new schoolmarm was arriving from back east." "And what else does Wallace Creek say about me?" Zoe asked, settling back against the bedroll. Luke glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "Not much. Just that you're from Boston, you're educated, and you're the niece of Hiram Baker." "Uncle Hiram," Zoe confirmed. "He's been writing to me for years about the opportunities out west." "He's a good man," Luke said, striking a match to light the kindling. "Honest businessman, people respect him." Zoe watched as Luke efficiently built up the fire, then moved to his supplies to retrieve a pot and some provisions. His movements were economical, practiced a man who had spent years living in the elements. "I can't thank you enough for your help, Mr. Irving," she said. "Luke," he corrected, filling the pot with water from a larger container. "Out here, formality doesn't count for much." "Luke," Zoe repeated, testing the name. "Then you must call me Zoe." He glanced at her, a hint of a smile tugging at his lips. "I'm not sure that's proper for a schoolmarm." "Perhaps not in town," Zoe conceded. "But out here, as you say, formality doesn't count for much." Luke's smile widened slightly as he set the pot over the fire and began adding ingredients for what appeared to be a simple stew. "Fair enough, Zoe." As Luke prepared the meal, Zoe took the opportunity to study him more carefully. He was older than she'd initially thought, perhaps 30 or 31, with streaks of silver at his temples that contrasted with his otherwise dark hair. His clothing was worn but clean, practical for life on the frontier. Despite his rough exterior, there was an intelligence in his eyes that intrigued her. "How did you come to be traveling alone?" Luke asked, breaking the silence. "Most newcomers join a wagon train or hire guides with good reputations." Zoe sighed, embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "My original plan was to take the train to Tucson, then travel by stage to Wallace Creek. But when I reached Tucson, I discovered the stage wouldn't run for another week due to raids along the route." Luke nodded grimly. "Apache troubles have been worse this year." "I was impatient," Zoe admitted. "The school term is set to begin in 2 weeks, and I wanted time to prepare. A man at the hotel said he could guide me privately for a reasonable fee. It seemed like the perfect solution." "Until he abandoned you to die," Luke said bluntly. "Yes," Zoe agreed quietly. "I see now how foolish I was." Luke stirred the stew, his expression thoughtful. "Not foolish. Just inexperienced. The West is different from the East, Zoe. People can be desperate here, and desperation makes men do terrible things." "Is that what you think happened?" "He was desperate," Luke shook his head. "No, he was greedy and cruel, likely planned to rob you all along." He looked up, meeting her eyes directly. "Did he take your belongings?" Zoe nodded miserably. "My trunk with most of my clothes and books, my money. He left me my reticule with a few coins and my carpet bag with some essentials." "Where is your bag now?" "About 5 miles back, I imagine," Zoe said bitterly. "It became too heavy to carry." Luke was silent for a moment, then said, "I'll backtrack tomorrow, see if I can find it." "You don't need to do that," Zoe protested. "I know I don't need to," Luke replied simply, "but I will." The stew began to bubble, filling the air with a savory aroma that made Zoe's stomach growl audibly. Luke smiled at the sound. "Almost ready," he said. "It's not fancy, but it'll put strength back in you." When the stew was done, Luke filled a tin cup and handed it to Zoe along with a spoon. "Eat slowly," he advised. "Your stomach needs to adjust after what you've been through." The stew was simple beans, jerky, and some wild onions, but to Zoe, it tasted better than the finest meal she'd ever had in Boston. She followed Luke's advice, eating slowly, savoring each mouthful. As the sun began to set, painting the desert in shades of gold and crimson, Zoe felt her eyelids growing heavy. The combination of food, water, and relief from her ordeal was overwhelming her depleted body. "Rest," Luke said, noticing her struggle to stay awake. "You're safe here." "What about you?" Zoe asked, her voice thick with approaching sleep. "I'll keep watch," Luke replied, his eyes scanning the darkening landscape. "Sleep well, Zoe Michaels." Those were the last words she heard before surrendering to exhaustion. Zoe woke to the gentle sounds of morning birds calling, the soft snort of a horse, the crackle of a fire. For a moment she was disoriented, unsure where she was or how she had come to be there. Then the memory of the previous day came rushing back, the heat, the thirst, the despair. And Luke Irving. She sat up slowly, relieved to find her strength somewhat restored. Looking around, she saw no sign of her rescuer, but the fire was freshly built and a pot of coffee sat at its edge. "Luke," she called tentatively. "Over here," came his reply from behind the lean-to. "Just checking on Storm." A moment later, Luke appeared, leading his chestnut stallion. The morning light cast him in a different aspect than the harsh afternoon sun had. His features seemed less severe, though no less striking. "How are you feeling?" he asked, his eyes assessing her condition. "Much better," Zoe replied honestly. "Though I confess I'm rather stiff." Luke nodded. "That's to be expected. The desert takes a toll on the body." He secured Storm's reins to a nearby shrub and moved to the fire. "Coffee, please," Zoe said, carefully standing and smoothing her wrinkled dress. She was acutely aware of her disheveled appearance, her hair coming loose from its pins, her face likely sunburned, her clothing dirty and rumpled. Back in Boston, she would never have allowed anyone to see her in such a state. But this wasn't Boston, and Luke Irving wasn't a Boston gentleman. He handed her a tin cup of coffee without comment on her appearance, then gestured to a flat rock near the fire. "Sit. I've got some biscuits warming by the fire. Not as good as fresh baked, but they'll do." Zoe accepted the coffee gratefully and took a seat on the indicated rock. The coffee was strong and black, nothing like the delicately flavored brew she was accustomed to, but its warmth and stimulation were welcome. "I thought I might ride back and look for your carpet bag," Luke said, retrieving several flat biscuits from beside the fire. "If you're feeling up to it, you could come along, better than staying here alone." "I'd like that," Zoe said, accepting a biscuit. "I don't relish the idea of being alone out here again." Luke's expression darkened momentarily. "No, I expect not." He took a sip of his own coffee. "We should be able to reach Wallace Creek by nightfall if we find your bag quickly." "Do you think it will still be there?" Zoe asked doubtfully. Luke shrugged. "Hard to say. Not many travelers on that trail this time of year. Might be right where you left it." They ate in comfortable silence, the desert gradually warming around them as the sun climbed higher. After breakfast, Luke efficiently broke camp, packing everything onto Storm with practiced ease. "Ready?" he asked, offering Zoe his hand to help her mount. She nodded, placing her hand in his and allowing him to boost her onto the horse's back. Luke swung up behind her, just as he had the day before, but this time Zoe was fully conscious of the intimate position, his chest against her back, his arms around her to hold the reins. In Boston, such proximity to a man she barely knew would have been scandalous. Here, it was simply practical. Still, Zoe couldn't help but be aware of his solid presence, the clean scent of him despite days on the trail, the careful way he held himself to give her as much space as possible under the circumstances. They set off at a steady pace, retracing the path Zoe had taken the day before. The desert looked different in the morning light, still harsh and unforgiving, but somehow less menacing. Or perhaps it was simply the company that made the difference. "Have you always been a teacher?" Luke asked after they had ridden in silence for some time. "No," Zoe replied. "I was a governess for a wealthy family in Boston for the past 5 years. Before that, I attended the normal school to train as a teacher." "And what brought you west? There must be plenty of teaching positions in Boston." Zoe considered the question. "I suppose I wanted an adventure," she said finally. "My parents died when I was 17, influenza, and I've been on my own ever since. Uncle Hiram is my only remaining family, and his letters about Wallace Creek made it sound like a place where I could make a difference." "The town needs a good teacher," Luke agreed. "Lot of children growing up with no proper schooling." "What about you?" Zoe asked, turning the conversation away from herself. You said you came west after the war, but why Arizona specifically? She felt Luke's slight shrug behind her. No particular reason. Just kept moving until I found a place that felt right. Worked as a ranch hand for a few years, saved every penny, then bought my own spread when the opportunity arose. And do you have family? Zoe asked, then immediately wondered if the question was too personal. None to speak of, Luke replied after a brief hesitation. Father died before the war, mother passed while I was fighting, no siblings. I'm sorry, Zoe said softly. It was a long time ago, Luke said, his tone matter-of-fact rather than emotional. The ranch keeps me busy enough that I don't dwell on it much. They continued riding, the conversation flowing more easily than Zoe would have expected. Luke told her about Wallace Creek, the people, the businesses, the surrounding ranches and farms. He described the schoolhouse, recently built by community effort, and the town's hopes for growth and prosperity. There it is, Zoe said suddenly, pointing to a spot off the trail. My carpetbag. Luke guided Storm off the path toward the small blue bag, which lay partially hidden behind a large rock. He dismounted and retrieved it, checking the contents before handing it up to Zoe. Seems untouched, he said. You're in luck. Zoe clutched the bag gratefully. It wasn't much, but it contained her most immediate necessities: a change of undergarments, a nightgown, a hairbrush, and a few personal items. The loss of her trunk was still a bitter blow, but at least she wouldn't arrive in Wallace Creek with absolutely nothing. Luke mounted again, and they continued their journey. As the sun climbed higher, the heat intensified, reminding Zoe of her desperate situation the previous day. It's hard to believe I almost died out here, she said quietly. Luke's arms tightened slightly around her, a reflexive gesture of protection. But you didn't. You're stronger than you look, Zoe Michaels. I'm not sure strength had much to do with it, Zoe replied, if you hadn't come along when you did. But I did, Luke said firmly. No use dwelling on what might have been. They stopped at midday to rest Storm and eat a simple meal of jerky and dried fruit from Luke's provisions. The shade of a large boulder provided some relief from the sun, and Luke insisted that Zoe drink regularly from his canteen. The desert fools you, he explained. You can be dangerously dehydrated before you realize it. I understand that now, Zoe said ruefully. I thought I was prepared for the journey west, but I see how naive that was. Luke's expression softened. Don't be too hard on yourself. Everyone starts somewhere. The important thing is that you learn from experience. Is that what you did? Zoe asked. Learn from experience. A shadow crossed Luke's face. Sometimes the hard way, yes. Something in his tone told Zoe not to press further on that particular subject. Instead, she asked, will we reach Wallace Creek today? Luke nodded, surveying the landscape. By sunset, I reckon. It's about 20 miles from here. 20 miles on horseback. Zoe tried not to think about how her body would feel after such a journey, especially following her ordeal. But the alternative, another night in the desert, was less appealing. They set off again after their brief rest, the rhythm of Storm's steady gait lulling Zoe into a contemplative state. She found herself wondering about the life that awaited her in Wallace Creek. Would she fit in? Would the children respect her authority? Would the parents accept her teaching methods? And what of Luke Irving? Would their paths cross frequently in such a small community? The thought wasn't unpleasant. Penny for your thoughts, Luke said, breaking into her reverie. I was just wondering about Wallace Creek, Zoe admitted. About whether I'll be able to adapt to life there. It'll be different from Boston, Luke acknowledged. Simpler in some ways, harder in others. But the people are good for the most part. They'll welcome you. And what about you? Zoe asked, surprising herself with her boldness. Will I see you in town often? There was a brief silence before Luke replied, "I come in for supplies once a month or so, more often when there's cattle to sell or business at the bank." "I see," Zoe said, trying to keep the disappointment from her voice. It was foolish, really, to feel anything at all about the frequency of his visits to town. She barely knew the man, regardless of the intense circumstances of their meeting. "But," Luke continued, seemingly oblivious to her reaction, "I might find reason to visit more regularly, what with the school starting up." "Oh," Zoe couldn't help but ask. "Do you have children, Mr. Irving?" His surprised laugh rumbled through his chest. "No, no children. But I sit on the town council, and education is one of our priorities. It would be remiss of me not to check on the school's progress, wouldn't it?" Zoe smiled, though Luke couldn't see her face. "Indeed it would." The afternoon wore on, the landscape gradually changing as they traveled. The stark desert gave way to scrubland, with more vegetation and occasional signs of wildlife. Zoe's body ached from the prolonged ride, but she was determined not to complain. After all, this man had saved her life. The least she could do was endure some physical discomfort without whining. As the sun began its descent toward the western horizon, Luke pointed to a smudge in the distance. "There it is, Wallace Creek." Zoe strained her eyes, making out the faint outlines of buildings, not many but enough to constitute a proper town. Relief washed over her. She had made it against all odds. "Thank you," she said, turning her head slightly to address Luke directly, "for everything." His blue eyes met hers, surprisingly intense. "I made a promise, Zoe. I keep my promises." Something in his gaze made her heart beat faster, and she quickly looked away, focusing on the approaching town. It wouldn't do to develop an attachment to this man, no matter how heroic his actions had been. She was here to teach, to build a new life, not to lose her head over the first handsome cowboy who crossed her path. Still, as Wallace Creek grew larger in their view, Zoe couldn't help but wonder what the future might hold. The town of Wallace Creek was a modest collection of buildings arranged along a main street, with smaller residential structures spreading outward in a rough grid pattern. As Luke guided Storm down the dusty main thoroughfare, Zoe took in the sights: the general store, a saloon, a small church, what appeared to be a bank, and various other businesses she couldn't immediately identify. People stopped to watch them pass, their curious gazes lingering on the unusual sight of a man and woman sharing a horse. Zoe felt her cheeks warm with embarrassment at what they must be thinking, but Luke seemed unconcerned by the attention. "Where should I take you?" he asked, his voice close to her ear. "Your uncle's house." "Yes, please," Zoe replied. "Uncle Hiram said he lives behind his store." Luke nodded. "Baker's Mercantile, just up ahead on the left." The general store was a substantial two-story building with a wide porch and large display windows. A sign above the entrance proclaimed Baker's Mercantile ESD, 1869, in bold lettering. Luke guided Storm to a hitching post in front and dismounted before helping Zoe down. Her legs nearly buckled when they touched the ground, stiff from the long ride and still weak from her ordeal in the desert. Luke's strong hand steadied her, lingering on her waist a moment longer than strictly necessary. "Easy now," he murmured. "Take a minute to find your land legs." Before Zoe could respond, the store's door burst open and a portly, bearded man hurried onto the porch. "Zoe, my word, is that you?" the man exclaimed, his face a mixture of relief and concern. "We've been worried sick. You were due yesterday, Uncle Hiram." Zoe greeted him with genuine warmth, despite their limited previous acquaintance. His letters over the years had given her a sense of his character: practical, kind-hearted, and earnest. Hiram Baker hurried down the steps to embrace his niece, then held her at arm's length to examine her. You look absolutely exhausted, my dear. And sunburned too. What happened? Luke stepped forward. She had some trouble on the trail, Hiram. Her guide abandoned her about 30 miles out. Hiram's face darkened with anger. Abandoned? Who was this scoundrel? I don't know his full name, Zoe admitted. He called himself Johnson. He took my trunk and most of my money when our wagon broke down. The devil, Hiram exclaimed. We'll notify the sheriff at once. Such villainy cannot go unpunished. If I may, Luke interjected, Miss Michaels needs rest more than justice at the moment. She was suffering from heatstroke when I found her. Hiram's expression immediately shifted to concern. Of course, how thoughtless of me. Come inside, Zoe. My wife will tend to you. He turned to Luke, extending his hand. And thank you, Irving, for bringing my niece safely to town. I'm in your debt. Luke shook the offered hand. No debt, Hiram. Anyone would have done the same. Not anyone, Hiram said seriously. Not everyone has your character, son. He turned back to Zoe. Come, my dear. Martha has been preparing for your arrival for weeks. She'll be overjoyed to see you, though distressed by your condition, I'm sure. As Hiram led Zoe toward the store, she glanced back at Luke. Will you come in? I'm sure Uncle Hiram would offer you refreshment after our journey. Luke hesitated, then shook his head. Another time, perhaps. I should get Storm home and see to my stock. He tipped his hat. Good day, Miss Michaels. The return to formality stung slightly, though Zoe knew it was appropriate now that they were in town. Good day, Mr. Irving, and thank you again. Luke nodded once, then mounted Storm and rode away without further comment. Zoe watched him go, an inexplicable sense of loss washing over her. Fine man, Irving, Hiram commented as he guided Zoe into the store. One of the most respected ranchers in the area, despite keeping mostly to himself. He saved my life, Zoe said quietly. I would have died out there if he hadn't come along. Hiram squeezed her shoulder gently. Then I'm doubly in his debt. Come, let's get you settled. The next hour passed in a blur of introductions, explanations, and concerned fussing. Martha Baker, Hiram's wife of 30 years, was a motherly woman with kind eyes and capable hands. She whisked Zoe upstairs to the living quarters above the store, where a small but comfortable room had been prepared for her. You poor dear, Martha clucked as she helped Zoe out of her filthy traveling dress. To think of you out there alone in that dreadful heat, it's a miracle you survived. Yes, Zoe agreed, thinking of Luke's steady blue gaze. A miracle. Martha drew a bath, insisting that Zoe soak away the grime and fatigue of her journey. The warm water was heavenly, and Zoe found herself dozing off, the events of the past 2 days catching up with her. Don't you fall asleep and drown, Martha warned, rousing her. Into bed with you. Dinner can wait until you've had a proper rest. Zoe didn't argue. Dressed in a borrowed nightgown, her own was in desperate need of washing. She slid between clean sheets and was asleep almost instantly. She dreamed of the desert not as a place of danger and death, but as a vast, beautiful expanse under a star-filled sky. In her dream, Luke was there, his presence a comfort rather than a necessity, his hand warm in hers as they looked out over the moonlit landscape. When Zoe woke, it was dark outside her window, and for a disorienting moment, she wasn't sure where she was. Then the events of the previous day came rushing back, and she remembered she was in Wallace Creek, in her uncle's house, safe and sound. A gentle knock at the door preceded Martha's entrance, carrying a tray laden with food. You've slept through the afternoon and evening, dear, she said, setting the tray on a small table. Hiram and I didn't have the heart to wake you, but you need to eat something. The aroma of chicken stew and fresh bread made Zoe's stomach growl. Thank you, Martha. I'm famished. As Zoe ate, Martha sat in a rocking chair by the window, filling her in on the town gossip and the preparations for the new school term. Zoe tried to focus, but her thoughts kept drifting to Luke Irving and his unexpectedly gentle care in the desert. "The schoolhouse is all ready for you," Martha was saying. "The town's quite proud of it, built it just last year with volunteer labor. Even Luke Irving came in to help with the roof, and he usually keeps to his ranch." Zoe's attention sharpened at the mention of Luke. "Uncle Hiram mentioned that Mr. Irving is well respected in the community." Martha nodded. "Oh yes, very much so. He came here with nothing after the war, worked harder than two men for old Jeb Wilson, saved every penny, and eventually bought his own place when Jeb decided to retire. Built it up from practically nothing to one of the most successful ranches in the county." "He doesn't seem to come to town often," Zoe commented, trying to sound casual. Martha's eyes twinkled knowingly. "No, he's something of a solitary man. Had some trouble a few years back that made him even more private." "Trouble?" Zoe couldn't help asking. Martha hesitated. "Well, I shouldn't gossip, but I suppose you'll hear it eventually. Luke was engaged to a young woman from Tucson, daughter of a banker, very refined. She came to visit the ranch and apparently found it too rustic for her taste. Broke off the engagement and married a lawyer instead." "How awful for him," Zoe said, genuinely sympathetic. "Indeed. He took it hard from what Hiram says, threw himself into his work, expanded his ranch, rarely socializes now except for necessary business." Martha sighed. "A shame, really. He's a good man, deserves some happiness." Zoe mulled this over as she finished her meal. It explained something of Luke's reserved manner, his self-sufficiency, his seeming comfort with solitude. Yet he had been nothing but kind to her, risking his own well-being to save a stranger. "I should let you rest some more," Martha said, rising to take the empty tray. "Tomorrow, if you're feeling up to it, Hiram thought you might like to see the schoolhouse." "I'd like that very much," Zoe replied. "And I should write some letters to Boston to explain my situation and request replacements for the books and materials I lost." Martha patted her hand. "Don't you worry about that just yet. Rest and recover first. Wallace Creek is just happy you're here safe and sound." After Martha left, Zoe found herself too restless to sleep again. She moved to the window, looking out at the quiet town. Oil lamps glowed in a few windows, but most of the buildings were dark. In the distance, beyond the town limits, she thought she could make out a faint light, perhaps from a ranch house on the surrounding plain. Was Luke Irving out there somewhere, going about his evening routine on his solitary ranch? Had he thought of her at all since leaving her at the mercantile? The questions were foolish, Zoe knew. She had no reason to expect that a brief encounter in the desert would mean anything to him beyond the satisfaction of a good deed done. And yet, she couldn't shake the memory of his arms around her on the long ride to town, the quiet confidence in his voice when he promised to see her safely to Wallace Creek, the intensity in his blue eyes when they parted. "Foolishness," Zoe murmured to herself, turning away from the window. Utter foolishness. But as she settled back into bed, she couldn't help but wonder if their paths would cross again soon. The next week passed in a blur of activity as Zoe settled into life in Wallace Creek. The schoolhouse, as Martha had said, was a source of pride for the community, a sturdy one-room building with rows of simple desks, a teacher's desk on a small raised platform, and a blackboard covering most of one wall. Bookshelves lined the back of the room, though they were sparsely filled. Not much of a library yet, Hiram had explained apologetically during their tour. "Folks donate what they can, but books are a luxury out here. We'll build it up over time," Zoe had assured him, already making mental plans to write to her former employers and colleagues in Boston to request donations. Word of Zoe's ordeal in the desert had spread throughout the small community, and she found herself receiving visitors bearing gifts: a freshly baked pie from the blacksmith's wife, a handmade quilt from the church ladies' circle, offers of loans of clothes and books until her replacements could arrive from the east. The town's response to her plight was heartwarming, making Zoe feel welcome despite her short time in Wallace Creek. Sheriff Mills had taken her statement about the man who had abandoned her, promising to keep an eye out for anyone matching Johnson's description. Though he warned her that such drifters were difficult to track, through it all, there was no sign of Luke Irving. Zoe told herself she wasn't looking for him specifically, but each time the bell above the mercantile's door jingled, she found herself glancing up expectantly. "He's probably busy with his ranch," Martha said kindly one afternoon, catching Zoe in one such moment. Spring is a demanding time for cattlemen. Zoe felt her cheeks flush with embarrassment at being so transparent. "I merely wish to thank him properly," she said, focusing intently on the inventory list she was helping compile. Martha smiled knowingly but said nothing more on the subject. 10 days after her arrival in Wallace Creek, Zoe was arranging books on the schoolhouse shelves when the door opened behind her. Assuming it was Hiram bringing the new slate boards he had promised, she didn't turn immediately. "Just set them on the desk, Uncle," she called. "I'll organize them later." "I'm afraid I don't have any slate boards," a familiar deep voice replied. "Would these be an acceptable substitute?" Zoe whirled around to find Luke Irving standing in the doorway, holding a crate of books. He looked different than she remembered, cleaner, his beard trimmed, his clothing less trail-worn, but his blue eyes were just as intense as they had been in the desert. "Mr. Irving," Zoe said, her heart inexplicably racing. "This is a surprise." Luke stepped into the schoolhouse, setting the crate on the nearest desk. "I heard you were short on reading material for the students. These were gathering dust at my ranch, seemed a better use for them here." Zoe moved to the crate, examining its contents. There were about 24 books, some novels, some histories, a few volumes of poetry, all well-worn but carefully maintained. "These are yours?" she asked, running her fingers over a leather-bound copy of Wordsworth's poems. "Were my mother's," Luke said, a hint of softness in his voice. "She was a teacher before she married my father, always believed in the power of education." Zoe looked up at him, touched by the personal nature of the gift. "I can't accept these if they're family heirlooms." Luke shook his head. "They're just sitting on shelves collecting dust. My mother would have wanted them used, especially for teaching. Besides," he added with a slight smile, "I've read them all more times than I can count. It's time they found new readers." "Then thank you," Zoe said sincerely. "They'll be treasured here." A slightly awkward silence fell between them. Luke removed his hat, turning it in his hands, a gesture that struck Zoe as uncharacteristically nervous for the confident man who had rescued her in the desert. "How are you settling in?" he asked finally. "Recovered from your ordeal?" "Yes, quite well," Zoe replied. "Everyone has been very kind. I'm nearly ready for classes to begin next week." Luke nodded, glancing around the schoolhouse. "It's a good building, solid construction, should be comfortable enough for teaching." "It's perfect," Zoe assured him. "Far better than I expected to find in a frontier town." Another silence stretched between them, this one more comfortable than the last. Zoe found herself studying Luke's face in the clear light of the schoolhouse, the fine lines at the corners of his eyes, the strong jaw now clean-shaven, the slight furrow between his brows that suggested habitual concentration. "I should let you get back to your preparations," Luke said eventually, replacing his hat. "Just wanted to drop these by while I was in town." "Thank you again," Zoe said, walking with him to the door, "both for the books and, well, for everything else. Luke paused at the threshold, turning to face her. For a moment, Zoe thought he might say something significant, but he merely nodded and said, "Good day, Miss Michaels." "Good day, Mr. Irving," she replied, watching as he strode down the path toward the main street. Only after he had disappeared from view did Zoe realize. She was clutching Wordsworth's poems to her chest like a lovesick girl. She set the book down with deliberate care and returned to her task. But her thoughts remained stubbornly fixed on the rancher who had saved her life, and then vanished from it, as suddenly as he had appeared. The first day of school arrived with perfect spring weather, mild temperatures, clear skies, and a gentle breeze that carried the scent of sage and wildflowers through the open windows of the schoolhouse. Zoe stood at the teacher's desk, watching as her students filed in 27 children ranging from 6 to 16 years of age, all dressed in their Sunday best for the occasion. The parents hovered at the back of the room, equally curious about the new schoolteacher from the East. Zoe had met some of them over the past 2 weeks, but others were seeing her for the first time, evaluating whether this city-bred woman could properly educate their children. Hiram had warned her that not everyone in Wallace Creek valued formal education equally. Some of the ranchers and farmers saw little use for book learning beyond basic reading, writing, and arithmetic. It would be up to Zoe to prove the broader value of education to the community. As the children settled into their seats, Zoe took a deep breath and prepared to address her first class. "Good morning," she began, her voice clear and confident despite her nerves. "My name is Miss Michaels, and I'm honored to be your teacher." The morning passed quickly as Zoe assessed the students' varying levels of knowledge, organized them into appropriate groups, and began establishing classroom routines. By noon, when the children were released for lunch, Zoe felt cautiously optimistic about her new position. "You've made quite an impression," Hiram said as the last of the parents departed, leaving Zoe alone with her uncle. Even Jed Thornton seemed impressed, and he's been the loudest opponent of wasting money on fancy schooling, as he puts it. "I hope I can maintain their confidence," Zoe replied, straightening a row of books. "Some of the older children have significant gaps in their education." "Do what you can," Hiram advised. "That's all anyone can ask." As the afternoon session began, Zoe noticed a tall figure standing at the back of the schoolyard, partially hidden by the shade of a cottonwood tree. Even at that distance, she recognized Luke Irving's distinctive posture. He wasn't approaching the schoolhouse, merely observing from afar. Zoe forced herself to focus on her students, though she was acutely aware of Luke's presence throughout the afternoon lesson. When she finally dismissed the class at 4 o'clock, she half expected him to be gone, but he was still there, leaning against the tree trunk as the children scattered to their homes. Taking a deep breath, Zoe gathered her courage and walked across the schoolyard to where he stood. "Mr. Irving," she greeted him, "have you come to inspect the educational facilities on behalf of the town council?" A hint of a smile touched Luke's lips. "Something like that. How was your first day?" "Challenging but rewarding," Zoe replied honestly. "The children are eager to learn, though their previous education has been inconsistent." Luke nodded. "Not many trained teachers willing to come this far west. The last one stayed only 3 months before returning east." "I don't plan to be so easily discouraged," Zoe assured him, lifting her chin slightly. "No, I don't imagine you are," Luke said, his blue eyes studying her with an intensity that made her heart beat faster. "A woman who survives what you did in the desert isn't likely to be frightened off by a classroom of children." "Was there something specific you wanted to discuss about the school?" Zoe asked, suddenly aware that they were standing alone in the schoolyard, potentially visible to anyone passing by. Luke seemed to realize the impropriety of the situation at the same moment. He straightened from his casual stance against the tree. "Actually, I came to invite you to dinner at my ranch this Sunday. Your uncle and aunt as well, of course," he added quickly, "as a proper welcome to Wallace Creek." The invitation surprised Zoe. Based on what Martha had told her about Luke's solitary habits, she wouldn't have expected him to host social gatherings. "That's very kind," she said carefully. "I'll have to check with Uncle Hiram and Aunt Martha, but I would be delighted to accept." Luke nodded, seeming relieved. "Good. That's good. I'll send a wagon for you around noon if that suits." "Perfectly," Zoe replied, trying to keep her voice even despite the unexpected flutter of excitement in her chest. "Until Sunday, then," Luke said, tipping his hat before turning to walk toward a chestnut horse storm, Zoe presumed tethered at the edge of the schoolyard. Zoe watched him go, puzzled by the invitation and her own reaction to it. It was merely a neighborly gesture. She told herself a courtesy extended to a newcomer by a respected community member. Nothing more. Yet as she gathered her things and locked the schoolhouse for the evening, she couldn't help but wonder what Luke Irving's ranch was like, and why a man who reportedly avoided social interaction had suddenly decided to invite guests for dinner. Sunday arrived clear and warm, with only a few wispy clouds drifting across the azure sky. Zoe dressed with particular care in one of the few good dresses she had left after losing her trunk, a blue cotton with white piping that Martha assured her was entirely appropriate for a Sunday dinner. "I still think it's odd," Hiram commented as they waited on the porch for Luke's wagon. "Irving's not one for entertaining. Can't remember the last time anyone was invited to his ranch socially." "Perhaps he's trying to be more involved with the community," Martha suggested, adjusting her bonnet. "He did donate those books to the school." Hiram replied, clearly unconvinced. "Well, it's a nice gesture, regardless of the reason." The sound of approaching wheels ended their speculation. A well-maintained wagon appeared, driven not by Luke himself but by an older Mexican man with a weathered face and kind eyes. "Buenos dias," the man called as he pulled the wagon to a stop. "I am Miguel Vega, foreman at the Irving Ranch. El Patron sends his apologies for not coming himself. A matter with the cattle required his attention." "No apology necessary," Hiram assured him, helping Martha and then Zoe into the wagon. "We appreciate the invitation." As they settled onto the wooden bench, Miguel flicked the reins, and the horses set off at a steady pace. The journey to Luke's ranch took them away from town on a well-traveled road that gradually transformed into a less defined track across the open range. "How long have you worked for Mr. Irving?" Zoe asked Miguel, curious about Luke's life. "Since he first bought the ranch, señorita," Miguel replied with obvious pride. 8 years now. My family work there too, my wife as housekeeper, my son as vaquero." "It must be a large operation," Hiram commented. Miguel nodded. Very good ranch. El Patron works hard, builds much from little." As they crested a small rise, Luke's ranch came into view in the valley below. Zoe's breath caught at the unexpected beauty of the place. A substantial 2-story house of adobe and timber stood in a grove of cottonwood trees, surrounded by various outbuildings, a barn, bunkhouse, corrals, and other structures Zoe couldn't immediately identify. A creek wound through the property, its banks lined with willows and wild grasses. "It's lovely," Zoe murmured, genuinely impressed. "El Patron chose this land for the water," Miguel explained. "Even in dry years the creek flows, good for cattle, good for growing things." As they approached the house, Zoe saw Luke emerge from the barn, speaking with a younger man who resembled Miguel, his son, presumably. Luke looked up at the sound of the wagon, raising a hand in greeting before saying something to the younger man and striding toward the house. By the time Miguel brought the wagon to a stop in front of the main house, Luke was waiting on the porch, looking unexpectedly formal in clean dark trousers and a white shirt with no vest or jacket, a concession to the warm weather, perhaps. "Welcome to the Diamond Eye," he said, helping Martha down from the wagon. "I hope the drive wasn't too dusty." "Not at all," Martha assured him. "What a beautiful property you have." Luke's expression warmed slightly as he surveyed his land. "Thank you, it's been a labor of love." When it was Zoe's turn to descend from the wagon, Luke's hands circled her waist, lifting her down with effortless strength. The brief contact sent an unexpected thrill through her, and she found herself momentarily flustered. "Thank you, Mr. Irving," she managed, smoothing her skirts to hide her reaction. "Luke, please," he said quietly. "At least while you're a guest in my home." "Luke," Zoe agreed, meeting his gaze briefly before looking away. The interior of the ranch house surprised Zoe with its comfort and refinement. She had expected a bachelor's quarters, functional but sparse, but the main room was well furnished with solid pieces that suggested Luke's success as a rancher. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with the companions to those he had donated to the school. A piano stood in one corner, its polished surface gleaming in the sunlight that streamed through large windows. "You play?" Zoe asked, gesturing toward the instrument. Luke shook his head. "It was my mother's. I keep it tuned out of respect for her memory, though no one's played it in years." "Zoe is quite accomplished on the piano," Martha offered. "Perhaps she could play for us later." Before Zoe could respond to this volunteering of her services, a middle-aged Mexican woman emerged from what appeared to be the kitchen, wiping her hands on an apron. "Ah, Rosa," Luke said. "May I present our guests, Hiram and Martha Baker and their niece, Miss Zoe Michaels." "Welcome," Rosa said with a warm smile. "Dinner will be ready soon. Can I bring refreshments while you wait?" "That would be lovely," Luke replied. "Perhaps in the garden. It's too fine a day to stay indoors." The garden behind the house was another surprise, a sheltered oasis of flowering plants, vegetables, and fruit trees, all meticulously maintained despite the harsh environment. "Rosa has a gift with growing things," Luke explained as they settled at a rustic table beneath a trellis covered with climbing roses. "She says it reminds her of her childhood home in Sonora." "It's beautiful," Zoe said sincerely. "I wouldn't have expected such a garden in this climate." "The creek helps," Luke said, "and Rosa's determination. She doesn't take no for an answer, even from Mother Nature." Rosa brought a pitcher of lemonade and glasses, setting them on the table with a flourish. "The senorita likes my garden?" she asked, clearly pleased by Zoe's admiration. "Very much," Zoe assured her. "It's like a piece of paradise." "That is what I tell Senor Luke," Rosa declared. "A home needs beauty, not just usefulness." She gave Luke a pointed look that suggested this was an ongoing discussion between them. Luke's lips quirked in a half-smile. "Rosa thinks I work too much and appreciate beauty too little." "All men are the same," Rosa said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "Always cattle and fences, never flowers and music." She turned to Martha. "Is your husband the same, Senora?" Martha laughed. "Hiram is a merchant, not a rancher, but yes, he's more concerned with inventory and accounts than aesthetics." "See," Rosa said triumphantly to Luke. "This is why men need women to remind them of the beautiful things in life." With that pronouncement, she returned to the kitchen, leaving a slightly embarrassed silence in her wake. Hiram cleared his throat. "Your operation seems to be thriving, Irving." The cattle I saw from the road looked healthy. Luke seized on the change of subject with evident relief, and the conversation shifted to ranch matters: the spring calving, the condition of the range, the prospects for the coming season. Zoe listened with interest, finding Luke's knowledge and passion for his work unexpectedly engaging. Dinner, when it was served, proved to be a feast: roast beef with all the trimmings, fresh vegetables from the garden, and a variety of Mexican dishes that Rosa proudly explained were family recipes passed down through generations. Throughout the meal, Zoe found herself increasingly drawn to Luke. Away from town, in the comfort of his own home, he was more relaxed, even occasionally humorous. He spoke intelligently on a variety of subjects, revealing an education that seemed at odds with his frontier lifestyle. "You seem well-read for a cattleman," Zoe observed during a lull in the conversation. "My mother's influence," Luke replied. "She insisted I have a proper education, even after my father died and money was tight. I attended university for 2 years before the war interrupted." "What did you study?" Zoe asked, genuinely curious. "History and literature primarily," Luke said. "I had some notion of becoming a professor someday." He smiled slightly at Zoe's obvious surprise. "Hard to picture, isn't it? Me in a classroom instead of on horseback." "Not at all," Zoe replied honestly. "You clearly have an academic mind. It's just unexpected to find it here, I suppose." "Life takes unexpected turns," Luke said, his expression growing more serious. "The war changed everything for many of us." After dinner, at Martha's insistence, Zoe was persuaded to play the piano. The instrument was in excellent condition despite its disuse, and Zoe lost herself in the music, playing pieces she hadn't performed since leaving Boston. When she finished a particularly moving Chopin nocturne, she looked up to find Luke watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. There was something in his gaze, an emotion she couldn't quite name, that seemed to reach across the room and touch her physically. The moment was broken when Hiram checked his pocket watch and announced that they should start back to town before darkness fell. "Of course," Luke agreed, though Zoe thought she detected a hint of reluctance in his voice. "Miguel will bring the wagon around." As they prepared to leave, Luke drew Zoe aside while Hiram and Martha said their farewells to Rosa. "I hope you enjoyed your visit," he said quietly. "Very much," Zoe replied with complete sincerity. "Your home is lovely and dinner was wonderful." Luke hesitated, then said, "Perhaps you might visit again. The school board will be meeting soon to discuss the term, and we could review matters beforehand." It was a thin pretext and they both knew it, but Zoe nodded. "I'd like that." "Good," Luke said, a genuine smile warming his features. "That's good." The ride back to town was filled with Martha's enthusiastic commentary on the ranch, the meal, and their host. But Zoe found herself unusually quiet, replaying the day in her mind and wondering at the strange connection she felt to Luke Irving, a man she barely knew, yet who had somehow come to occupy an unexpectedly large space in her thoughts. As spring progressed into early summer, Zoe found her life settling into a pleasant routine. The school thrived under her care, with even the most reluctant students showing improvement in their studies. The community had largely accepted her, impressed by her dedication and the results she was achieving with their children. True to his word, Luke began visiting town more frequently. He always had a plausible reason: school board meetings, supplies at the mercantile, business at the bank, but he inevitably found time to stop by the schoolhouse or Hiram's store when Zoe was present. Their conversations were proper, often focusing on educational matters or community concerns, but Zoe was acutely aware of the undercurrent between them, a mutual interest that went beyond the merely neighborly. Luke never overstepped the bounds of propriety, yet his attention to her was marked enough to draw notice. That's the third time this week Irving's found reason to come to town. Hiram observed one evening after Luke had stopped by the mercantile just before closing. Used to be we'd see him once a month at most. Perhaps he's taking a more active interest in community affairs, Zoe suggested, keeping her tone neutral despite the warmth she felt at the implication of Hiram's comment. Martha exchanged a knowing look with her husband. I'm sure that's it, dear. Nothing at all to do with certain new arrivals in Wallace Creek. Zoe felt her cheeks flush. Aunt Martha, really? There's no shame in it, Martha said kindly. Luke Irving is a fine man, prosperous, respected, and clearly smitten with you. We barely know each other, Zoe protested, though her heart beat faster at Martha's assessment. Sometimes that doesn't matter, Hiram said, surprising Zoe with his romantic sentiment. I asked Martha to marry me 3 weeks after we met. When you know, you know. Well, I don't know anything of the sort, Zoe insisted, though her denial sounded weak even to her own ears. Mr. Irving and I are friendly acquaintances, nothing more. If you say so, dear, Martha replied, her tone making it clear she believed otherwise. 2 days later, Luke appeared at the schoolhouse just as Zoe was dismissing her students for the day. He waited patiently as the children filed out, several of the boys greeting him respectfully as they passed. Mr. Irving, Zoe said when they were finally alone, this is a pleasant surprise. Luke removed his hat, turning it in his hands in what Zoe had come to recognize as a nervous gesture. Miss Michaels, I hope I'm not interrupting your work. Not at all, Zoe assured him, gesturing to the nearly empty classroom. The day's teaching is done. Luke nodded, seeming to gather his thoughts. I was wondering if you might be free this Saturday for an outing. An outing, Zoe repeated, her pulse quickening. Yes, Luke said more confidently now. There's a spot about an hour's ride from here, a canyon with some ancient Indian drawings that I thought might interest you. Educational, you might say. Zoe smiled at his transparent attempt to frame the invitation in terms she couldn't reasonably refuse. That does sound interesting. Would it be just the two of us? Luke's expression grew more serious. I've asked Miguel's wife, Rosa, to accompany us as a chaperone. I wouldn't want to compromise your reputation. The consideration touched Zoe deeply. A man less concerned with propriety might have suggested they go alone, but Luke clearly respected her position in the community and the standards expected of a schoolteacher. In that case, I'd be delighted to accept, Zoe said. What time should I be ready? I'll come by the mercantile at 9, Luke replied, a smile breaking across his face. Wear something comfortable for riding. The trail can be rough in places. As he turned to leave, he paused at the door. I'm looking forward to it, Zoe, he said softly, using her first name for the first time since their journey to town. So am I, Luke, she replied, equally soft. After he had gone, Zoe sat at her desk for a long moment, her heart racing with an emotion she was no longer able to deny. In the short time she had known Luke Irving, he had become more than just her rescuer or a community leader. He had become someone whose presence she sought, whose approval she valued, whose smile could brighten her entire day. Oh dear, she murmured to the empty classroom. I'm in trouble, aren't I? Saturday dawned clear and perfect, with a gentle breeze tempering the early summer heat. Zoe dressed in her most practical outfit, a divided riding skirt that Martha had helped her fashion, a simple blouse and sturdy boots. She pinned her hair securely and added a wide-brimmed hat to protect against the sun. Luke arrived precisely at 9, driving a light buggy with Rosa seated in the back. Storm and another saddled horse were tethered to the rear of the vehicle. Good morning, Luke greeted her, his eyes taking in her practical attire with approval. "Ready for an adventure?" "Absolutely," Zoe replied, accepting his hand to climb into the buggy. Rosa smiled warmly at her. "Buenos dias, señorita. I bring lunch for us." She patted a basket beside her. "And water. Mucha water. El Patron says we must not forget after what happened to you." "Thank you, Rosa," Zoe said, touched by the thoughtfulness. The journey to the canyon was pleasant, with Luke pointing out landmarks and sharing stories of the area's history. Rosa occasionally interjected with local legends or bits of Mexican folklore related to the places they passed, adding another dimension to Zoe's understanding of her new home. As they traveled, Zoe was struck by how much at ease she felt in Luke's company. Their conversation flowed naturally, covering a wide range of topics from books they had both read to experiences that had shaped their lives. Luke spoke more freely of his time during the war than he had before, and Zoe shared stories of her childhood in Boston and her years as a governess. "Here we are," Luke announced eventually, bringing the buggy to a halt at the edge of what appeared to be a shallow ravine. "The canyon is just ahead, but we'll need to go on horseback from here. The buggy can't manage the trail." After helping Rosa and Zoe from the buggy, Luke unhitched the horses and prepared them for riding. "Rosa will ride with me," he explained. "Storm is gentle enough for you to manage alone, Zoe." With Luke's assistance, Zoe mounted Storm, remembering their long ride from the desert weeks earlier. This time, however, she was in the saddle alone, with Luke and Rosa on the other horse. The trail into the canyon was indeed rough in places, but Storm proved to be as sure-footed as Luke had promised. As they descended into the ravine, the landscape changed dramatically. Sheer rock walls rose on either side, carved by millennia of water flow, creating a hidden world of shadows and echoes. "It's beautiful," Zoe breathed, looking up at the towering cliffs. "Wait until you see the drawings," Luke said, guiding his horse around a bend in the canyon. The ancient artworks were even more impressive than Zoe had imagined. Figures of people and animals, geometric designs, and strange symbols covered a section of the canyon wall protected by an overhanging ledge. The ochre, black, and white pigments were still vivid despite their great age. "The Apache say these were made by the Ancient Ones," Luke explained as they dismounted to examine the drawings more closely. "They consider this a sacred place." Zoe approached the wall reverently, taking in the silent testimony of people long gone. "How old do you think they are?" "Hundreds of years, at least," Luke replied, standing beside her. "Perhaps thousands. No one knows for certain." They spent the next hour exploring the canyon, with Luke pointing out interesting geological features and Rosa sharing what she knew of the native beliefs about the place. Eventually, they settled in a shady spot near a small seep spring for the lunch Rosa had prepared. As they ate, Zoe found herself studying Luke when he wasn't looking her way. In this setting, away from town and its expectations, he seemed more relaxed, more open. The stern, reserved rancher was still present in his bearing, but there was a lightness to him that Zoe found utterly charming. "Tell me about your dreams," Luke said suddenly, surprising her with the personal question. "My dreams," Zoe repeated, considering. "I suppose I've always wanted to make a difference through education, to help children see possibilities beyond their circumstances." "Is that why you came west?" Luke asked. "There must have been teaching positions in Boston." Zoe nodded slowly. "Partly, but I also wanted adventure, I suppose. A chance to build something of my own, away from the constraints of society back east." "And has it been what you hoped?" Luke's blue eyes were intent on her face, genuinely interested in her answer. "More than I could have imagined," Zoe replied honestly. despite the rather dramatic beginning. Luke smiled at that. The desert has a way of revealing character. Some break under its harshness, others endure. I would have broken if not for you, Zoe said quietly. I don't believe that, Luke countered. You have more strength than you realize, Zoe Michaels. Their gazes held for a long moment, and Zoe felt something shift between them, a deepening of connection that made her heart race. Rosa, busy repacking the lunch basket, seemed not to notice the charged moment. The ride back to town was quieter, a companionable silence settling between them as they each contemplated the day's experiences. When they reached the Mercantile, the sun was low in the sky, casting long shadows across Wallace Creek's Main Street. Luke helped Zoe down from the buggy, his hands lingering at her waist slightly longer than necessary. Thank you for coming today, he said softly. It meant a great deal to me. Thank you for showing me such a wonderful place, Zoe replied, equally soft. I'll never forget it. As Rosa tactfully busied herself with the horses, Luke took Zoe's hand in his. I'd like to call on you properly, Zoe, he said, his voice low but clear. With your uncle's permission, of course. The formal request, so unexpected yet so welcome, brought a flush of pleasure to Zoe's cheeks. I would like that very much, Luke. His smile then warm, genuine, and just for her was something Zoe knew she would treasure always. Until then, Luke said, releasing her hand reluctantly. Until then, Zoe echoed, watching as he helped Rosa back into the buggy and took the reins. As the buggy pulled away, Zoe stood on the Mercantile's porch, her heart full of a joy she hadn't expected to find in this remote frontier town. Whatever the future held, she knew that her decision to come west had led her not just to a new career, but to a possibility of happiness she had never anticipated. True to his word, Luke called on Hiram the very next day to formally request permission to court Zoe. Hiram, who had observed the growing connection between his niece and the rancher with quiet approval, gave his blessing without hesitation. She's her own woman, Hiram told Luke, but for what it's worth, I think you'd suit each other well. Word of the courtship spread quickly through Wallace Creek's efficient gossip network. Zoe found herself the object of increased attention from the town's residents, particularly the mothers of her students, who seemed divided between approval of Luke's prosperity and concern over his reputation as a solitary, sometimes stern man. Don't you worry about what people say, Martha advised when Zoe mentioned some of the comments she had overheard. They'll talk no matter what you do. The question is, does Luke Irving make you happy? Yes, Zoe replied without hesitation. He does, and it was true. Over the following weeks, as spring gave way to the full heat of summer, Luke's courtship proved to be both respectful and attentive. He called at the Mercantile regularly, sometimes bringing small gifts, a book he thought she might enjoy, wildflowers he had collected on the range, once even a delicate silver brooch he had commissioned from a silversmith in Tucson. They took rides together, always properly chaperoned, attended church services side by side, and spent quiet evenings on the Mercantile's porch, discussing everything from literature to the future of the Arizona Territory. Through it all, Zoe found herself falling more deeply in love with this complex man who had once saved her life and was now becoming essential to her happiness. What surprised her most was the gradual revelation of Luke's true character beneath his reserved exterior. The man who had been described to her as solitary and stern proved to have a dry wit, a profound sense of justice, and an unexpected tenderness that he revealed only to her. "You're different with me," Zoe observed one evening as they sat on the porch swing, Martha discreetly supervising from just inside the open door. "People in town think of you as austere, I suppose, but you're not really. Luke considered this. "The war taught me to keep my thoughts to myself," he said finally. "And afterward, building the ranch required a certain distance. Men respect strength more than friendliness out here." "And with me," Zoe prompted gently. Luke's expression softened as he looked at her. "With you, I don't need those walls. You see me as I am, not as I've had to be." The simple honesty of his statement touched Zoe deeply. "I'm glad," she said softly, "because the man I see is the one I've come to care for very much." Luke's eyes darkened with emotion. "Zoe," he began, then stopped, glancing toward the open door where Martha might be listening. "There's something I need to ask you, but not here, not like this." "What is it?" Zoe asked, her heart suddenly racing. "Come to the ranch for dinner this Sunday," Luke said. "Your uncle and aunt too, of course. There's something I want to show you." Curious though she was, Zoe didn't press for more details. "We'll be there," she promised. The intervening days passed with agonizing slowness. Zoe found herself distracted during lessons, her mind constantly wandering to what Luke might want to ask her, what he might want to show her. By Sunday morning, she was a bundle of nerves, taking unusual care with her appearance and changing her dress 3 times before settling on a pale blue frock that Martha insisted brought out the color of her eyes. When they arrived at the ranch, Luke was waiting on the porch, dressed more formally than Zoe had ever seen him. Dark trousers, a crisp white shirt, and a vest that hinted at his prosperous circumstances without being ostentatious. "You look beautiful," he said quietly as he helped her from the wagon, his eyes warm with appreciation. "Thank you," Zoe replied, suddenly shy under his intent gaze. "You look quite handsome yourself." Dinner was a pleasant affair, with Rosa outdoing herself on the meal and conversation flowing easily among the small group. Throughout the evening, Zoe was conscious of Luke watching her, a certain tension in his manner suggesting anticipation of what was to come. After the meal, as dusk began to settle over the ranch, Luke suggested a walk in the garden. "It's particularly beautiful at this time of day," he told Zoe, "and there's something special I'd like you to see." Hiram and Martha exchanged knowing glances, but made no comment as Luke offered Zoe his arm and led her out to the garden. The evening air was fragrant with roses and the distant scent of sage from the surrounding rangeland. Fireflies had begun to appear, their tiny lights blinking on and off among the plants. "It's magical," Zoe said, genuinely enchanted by the scene. "This way," Luke said, guiding her toward a secluded corner of the garden she hadn't seen during her previous visit. As they rounded a hedge of flowering shrubs, Zoe gasped in surprise. Before them was a small, perfect garden house, a miniature replica of the main ranch house, but scaled for a child's play. "Luke, what?" Zoe began, confused by the unexpected sight. "It was my project this past month," Luke explained, his voice slightly nervous. "Rosa's granddaughter helped with the details." "But why?" Zoe asked, stepping closer to examine the charming structure, which was large enough for a child to enter but scaled perfectly in every detail. Luke took a deep breath, then turned to face her directly. "Because I wanted to show you that I'm thinking of the future, of children, of a family." Zoe's heart began to race as Luke took her hands in his. "Zoe Michaels," he said, his voice steady despite the emotion evident in his eyes. "When I found you in the desert that day, I made a promise to get you safely to Wallace Creek. What I didn't realize then was that finding you would change my life completely." He paused, his thumbs gently stroking the backs of her hands. "I've lived alone for years, convinced myself I preferred it that way, but these past months with you have shown me how empty my life was before. You've brought light and joy back into my world, and I can't imagine returning to the darkness." Slowly, deliberately, Luke lowered himself to one knee, still holding Zoe's hands in his. "I love you, Zoe, with all my heart. Would you do me the extraordinary honor of becoming my wife?" Tears of joy filled Zoe's eyes as she looked down at this man who had saved her life in more ways than one. "Yes," she whispered, then more strongly, "yes, Luke, I love you too." Luke rose to his feet, his face transformed by happiness. Gently, reverently, he cupped her face in his hands and lowered his lips to hers in their first kiss, tender, sweet, and full of promise. When they finally parted, Luke rested his forehead against hers. "I was so afraid you might say no," he admitted. "That perhaps it was too soon, or that life on a ranch might not be what you wanted." Zoe smiled, her heart too full for words for a moment. "Luke Irving," she finally managed, "I came west seeking adventure and purpose. I found both and the love of my life because you poured your canteen and promised to see me safely home. How could I possibly say no to spending the rest of my life with you?" Luke's answering smile was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Then let's tell your uncle and aunt the news," he said, offering his arm once more. "I believe they've been expecting it." The wedding took place 6 weeks later in the small church in Wallace Creek. The entire community turned out for the occasion, the schoolchildren forming an honor guard for their beloved teacher, the ranchers and townspeople filling every pew in a show of respect for Luke. Zoe wore a gown of ivory satin that Martha had helped her make, with lace from her mother's wedding dress as the veil. Luke, standing at the altar in a new suit ordered specially from Tucson, watched her approach with such naked adoration that several of the town's women were seen dabbing at their eyes before the ceremony even began. The vows were simple and heartfelt, the couple's voices clear and unwavering as they pledged their lives to each other. When the minister pronounced them man and wife, Luke's kiss was both tender and passionate, drawing appreciative murmurs from the congregation. The celebration afterward was the largest Wallace Creek had seen in years, tables laden with food prepared by the town's women, music provided by local musicians, and dancing that continued well into the night. Through it all, Luke kept Zoe close to his side, his happiness evident to all who saw them together. As evening fell and the party continued, Luke drew Zoe away from the crowds to a quiet corner of the churchyard. "Happy?" he asked, his arms encircling her waist. "Completely," Zoe assured him, leaning into his embrace. "I never imagined when I left Boston that I would find such joy." "Nor I," Luke admitted. "After Elizabeth broke our engagement, I thought I was done with love, convinced myself I preferred solitude." Zoe had heard the story of Luke's broken engagement from Martha, but this was the first time he had mentioned it directly. "What changed your mind?" she asked softly. Luke's smile was tender as he gazed down at her. "You did. Finding you in the desert, seeing your courage in the face of death, watching you build a life here despite every obstacle. How could I not fall in love with you?" "I'm glad you found me," Zoe said, her voice thick with emotion. "Even if the circumstances were less than ideal." "I would walk through fire to find you," Luke said seriously. "Cross deserts, climb mountains, whatever it took." Their second kiss as husband and wife was deeper, more intimate than the one they had shared in the church, a promise of the night to come and all the days that would follow. When they finally returned to the celebration, it was with the glow of a couple deeply in love and looking forward to their future together. That night, Luke took his bride home to the ranch that would now be their shared home, carrying her across the threshold in the traditional manner. "Welcome home, Mrs. Irving," he said, setting her gently on her feet in the main room that had been transformed with fresh flowers and candles in honor of their wedding night. "Home," Zoe repeated, looking around at the room that had seemed so impressive on her first visit, but now represented so much more: a life shared, a future together, a love that had begun in the harshest of circumstances, but had flourished against all odds. Later, much later, as they lay together in the intimate darkness of their bedroom, Luke traced the contours of Zoe's face with gentle fingers. "I made a promise when I found you in the desert," he murmured, "to see you safely to Wallace Creek or die trying." "You kept that promise," Zoe said, pressing a kiss to his palm. "I'm making you a new one now," Luke continued, "to love you, protect you, and cherish you for all the days of my life, and I intend to keep that promise too." "I know you will," Zoe replied with perfect confidence. "Just as I'll keep mine to love you and stand by you through whatever life brings us." Their lips met in a kiss that sealed their vows more permanently than any ceremony could have done a promise of forever. Begun in a moment of desperate need in the desert, and now blossoming into a lifetime of love and shared purpose. 5 years later, Zoe stood on the porch of the ranch house, watching as Luke taught their 4-year-old son, James, to ride his first pony. Their 2-year-old daughter, Elizabeth, named for Luke's mother, sat on Zoe's hip, her chubby hands clapping in delight at her brother's achievement. "Careful, Jamie," Zoe called as the boy bounced enthusiastically in the small saddle. "Remember what Papa taught you about sitting steady." "I remember, Mama," James called back, his face a miniature version of Luke's with the same determined expression. "I'm being careful." Luke walked alongside the pony, one hand ready to catch the boy if needed, but his expression was one of pride rather than concern. He had proven to be a natural father, patient, loving, and dedicated to passing on his knowledge to the next generation. The ranch had prospered in the years since their marriage. Luke's careful management had expanded the herd and improved the bloodlines, making the Diamond Eye one of the most successful operations in the territory. Zoe had continued teaching for 2 years after their wedding, finally retiring when James was born. Yet education remained a priority for both of them. Luke had donated land and materials for a larger schoolhouse in Wallace Creek, and Zoe still served on the school board, helping to recruit qualified teachers and expand the curriculum. Their home had expanded as well, with additions to accommodate their growing family and the frequent visitors they now entertained. Luke, once known for his solitary habits, had become a respected community leader, hosting gatherings and actively participating in territorial affairs. "Look, Mama. I'm doing it," James crowed as Luke released the lead rope, allowing the pony to walk freely with its small rider. "Wonderful, darling," Zoe called back, her heart swelling with love for her son and the man who was guiding him with such care. Rosa, now a beloved grandmother figure to the children, emerged from the house wiping her hands on her apron. "Lunch is ready, Senora," she announced. "Shall I call them in?" "Let them have a few more minutes," Zoe replied, smiling as Luke scooped James from the pony's back and tossed him high in the air, the boys' delighted laughter ringing across the yard. "They're having too much fun to interrupt." Rosa nodded knowingly. "El Patron loves his son very much, as he loves you and the little señorita." She tickled Elizabeth under the chin, drawing a giggle from the toddler. "We're very blessed," Zoe agreed, and they were. The life they had built together was rich in all the ways that mattered: love, family, purpose, and community. The challenges they had faced, from drought to cattle rustlers, from difficult births to the normal strains of marriage, had only strengthened their bond. As Luke carried James toward the house, the boy chattering excitedly about his riding adventure, Zoe felt a familiar wave of gratitude wash over her. How different her life might have been if Luke hadn't found her that day in the desert, if he hadn't poured his precious water down her parched throat and promised to see her safely home. "What are you thinking about?" Luke asked as he reached the porch, setting James down to run inside ahead of them. "You have that far-away look in your eyes." "I was thinking about the day we met," Zoe admitted. "About how close I came to dying out there and how you saved me." Luke's expression softened as he reached out to caress Elizabeth's cheek, then Zoe's. "I think perhaps we saved each other," he said quietly. "I was dying in a different way before I found you living but not truly alive." "Papa, come on," James called from inside. "Rosa made apple pie." Luke grinned, the years falling away from his face as he shared a look of amusement with Zoe. "Duty calls, it seems." "Indeed it does," Zoe agreed, shifting Elizabeth to her other hip. "Best not keep the young master waiting. You know how he is about Rosa's pie." "Like his father," Luke admitted, placing a quick kiss on Zoe's lips before taking Elizabeth from her arms. "Come along, little one. Let's see if Rosa saved you a special piece." As they entered the house together, surrounded by the sights and sounds of their family home, Zoe sent up a silent prayer of thanksgiving for the journey that had brought her west, for the hardship that had led to her greatest joy, and for the man who had not only saved her life, but had made it more beautiful than she could have ever imagined. What had begun as a desperate encounter in the desert had blossomed into a love story that would be told in their family for generations, to come a testament to courage, compassion, and the unexpected paths that lead two hearts to find each other, even in the harshest of circumstances.